Right, so the cash for keys, the terms you mentioned, is that's where, and this has been in the news lately, that they will offer the occupants $500, $750, $1,000
Or more.
to leave the property on a specified date, and more importantly, to leave it in good condition.
Correct.
Because a lot of times properties might be trashed by the time you get there.
Oh, they're bad sometimes. The biggest, the real bad ones is they like to pour cement down the toilets and the sinks.
Oh, there you
and
go.
they just like to do, some people do really things.
Because I showed a foreclosure recently, and it was a house that had been rebuilt a few years earlier, and all the kitchen cabinets were gone.
Yeah.
And the stove.
Yeah, that some people just take everything. And they
Anything.
believe they owned it.
Yeah, well. Okay, now in terms of the sale itself and the qualified bidders, let's say you want to bid on one of these
If
properties.
somebody wants to go out and buy,
Somebody wants to buy, you hear a lot of people say, gosh, now's a good time, I'm going to buy a foreclosure.
correct.
So how does one go about buying a foreclosure, for instance, on the courthouse steps?
Okay, they have to investigate, obviously, and find out everything, because they're not going to be, there's not going to be anything like a listing on the property or anything. They have to do their due diligence by finding out through service or through a title company as many facts as they can.
Right.
And many times they're not going to get inside to see the house, so they have to kind of estimate how much is done. So they come up with what they think is a good bid, they compare it to what the opening bid will be, and then they go to the sale. And if it's got a lot of equity, there'll be many people bidding sometimes. So it's
Okay, let's speak about that for a minute. So the trustee says it's advertised how much that property is going to be, the starting bid is.
the starting bid is the bid of the lender, called a credit bid, and the lender then will make that bid, and that's the bid that it's announced. It includes everything that's owed on the property. It includes the principal, all the trustees' fees, and all the other costs.
Okay, and that's where the investor or the person new to this industry or this part of the real estate has to drive by the house and do their due diligence to find out how much is the house really worth and what they are willing to pay for it, and perhaps how much they would need to fix the property up.
Yes, and then they also got to try to check to make sure how much the property taxes are in arrears. They have to check to make sure that there are no other liens. They have to make sure that there are no other costs involved. There could be a second. There's been people many times who have bought properties at the courthouse steps, and then they later find out that there's a first, and what they bought was a second.
Ooh, ouch, okay. Now, in terms of the, if they're a buyer of a foreclosure,
Yes.
and they're the winning bid, and then back to what we spoke about, the occupants are still there. They're sitting there watching TV.
That's right. So then this new owner will have to go out and try to arrange or buy them out, which we call, they will have to give cash for keys, or they'll have to start an eviction because they have to get a writ of possession. So they'd give a 3-day notice to quit, then they'd have to start a regular everyday eviction.
And that could take up to how long?
Well, evictions take sometimes, there are horrible cases of evictions could take 1 or 2 months or even longer.
Okay.
You get a real professional tenant, it would be bad. And in fact, the law is a little bit different, I believe. If you have an owner in the property, you can give them a 3-day notice to quit. If there's a tenant in the property, they have to give a 30-day. But there is one other point you might want to be aware of for these people. If a person has a lease, on a property,
geez, good point.
if a person has a lease and the owner gets foreclosed, that lease is no longer valid, and the lender can come in and also kick the tenant out.
Wow.
And without having to pay back any deposits or anything else. So a person who is a tenant in a house that's going to be foreclosed could have problems also.
Okay. Now, Section 1695 Civil Code.
Yes, that's the section to protect the homeowner against the crooked investor. It was passed in 1979, and it was there because so many homeowners were scammed out of their property.
Right, and we hear about that on the news all the time now.
All the time. It's a shame, but they still come in and cheat them.
Okay, can you give a few examples? I know typically it's often the nice neighborhood person that's knocking on doors, or maybe somebody from their community or their church, or somebody that was introduced to to somebody that they trusted?
Probably the real scams are professionals, and they just
Right.
they go out and because the man next door probably they don't know how to do this. These people are pros,
Right.
and they will go out to the owner and tell them they will try to get them a new loan or try to get them some money, or
Right.
they'll take over the property and they get them to sign a grant deed. Then they'll run down and record the grant deed and get some hard money second and bleed some money out and just never make a payment.
So to break that down, with the friendly person that to help them, that ingrain themselves in their church or their community, is really a professional at doing
Yes.
scams like this, and he or she will convince the occupant that's in trouble that, why don't you sign the property over to me, we'll put it in our name or our
Correct.
company's name, you can live here, and then when we get this all resolved, we're deeded back to you.
Correct.
Is that basically
that'd
the-
be basically it.
Is that the biggest scam?
Well, there are
around
a lot of other
variations?
there are a lot of others where they'll say we'll try to get you a new loan.
Try and
we'll
get you a new loan.
But first we need to have you sign this deed, and then they'll go out and get a loan in their own name.
Okay, because that happens a lot, especially with the elderly, in elderly abuse cases.
Oh,
where-
it's terrible.
when we, and what about if in the trustee sales and estate auctions? Can you talk about the difference between estate auction and the trustee
Well,
sales?
this law that they're talking about that protects the homeowner, 1695, it is used unless the buyer fits one of the 6 exemptions there.
Right.
So if the buyer from the person who's in foreclosure is going to use it as a personal residence,
Right.
or if the buyer buys it at a state auction, or if they buy it at an estate sale,
Right.
or they buy it at the trustee sale auction, and then there's one other exemption if you buy it from a blood relative. And on all these cases, then, they don't have to follow all those rules, because the 1695 rules protect the homeowner with, for example, 5 days cancellation, and they have to have 5 days to cancel. There's a 5-day cooling off period.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That's those rules that were passed.
So on those rules, in a nutshell, though, if an investor's coming in to buy,
Now, if a house is in foreclosure,
Right.
and knows the default, and somebody goes out and buys the property and is going to live in it, all these rules do not apply.
They're
They're
out the
applied to
window.
keep them from a crooked investor. And the crooked investor then has to give them a 5-day right to cancel. During the 5 days, nothing can be signed and no money can change hands. They also have to give them a contract in 10-point type.
Yeah.
They have to give them another notice in 14-point type that they can't do anything during that period. There's also a 2-year right of rescission, and they got a whole lot
Wow.
of extra rules when the investor is buying from a person in foreclosure.
that is fantastic. Duane, Gomer, thank you for coming on to our show today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Come to San Jose.
Yeah, Silicon Valley. Stick around, we'll do a show on short sales.
Yep.
Fantastic. Thanks again for watching Kapowich on Real Estate. This is a program dedicated to risk management in the residential real estate arena. We will see you next week.